to this day. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a little bit of how we arranged the exhibition and show you some of my favorite works in the show and bring up some of the themes that we helped to tease out through the show. And just to say that the show was organized pretty much chronologically. So you'll see me with a couple of moments of digression, kind of walking you through these two artists' lives, essentially from their early stages to their late stages, but also organized thematically and grouped around some pretty spectacular works of art that we borrowed from institutions across the country. So I want to introduce you to our protagonists. So you'll see artist Winslow Homer here on the far left with his jaunty three-piece suit and his summer hat, as well as Frederic Remington here in the middle, arrayed with some of his prodigious collection of indigenous materials. These are two artists who are separated by a generation. So Homer's born in 1836, Frederic Remington in 1861. But they're both Easterners by birth and men who spent many years of their lives really in and around the same very small elite circles on the East Coast, which is a surprise, certainly was for me in learning that about Frederic Remington, because we know him so much as the purveyor of images of the West. But this is a man who was, it turns out, really an Easterner through and through. They both came to understand particular landscapes and ways of life in important ways. And they were doing so at a moment that I just want to kind of begin by mentioning. It's the turn of the century is a moment of major upheaval in the United States. We're talking about big changes to technology. We're talking about huge influxes of immigrants to American cities, the expansion and then subsequent closure of the American frontier as indigenous populations are decimated. So a moment when Americans are also thinking about what frontier means even beyond the American continent, with imperial expansion in places like Cuba and the Philippines. So it's a moment when America is very much attempting to understand itself, attempting to understand even the very nature of its borders and its populations. So these two men are making art at this really interesting, juicy moment in American history. I want to mention too an important thing that we did that I'm particularly proud of in this show, which is to include the voices of a whole bunch of different experts and scholars as part of our exhibition didactics. So embedded in all of the text that we had throughout the show was not only the writing that I did and the thinking that I did and my colleagues and co-curators did, but we were also able to bring together this amazing group of experts, and you see them here, who were experts in indigenous studies, who were photojournalists. In one instance, Don Flemons, who was an expert in African-American cowboy songs, and someone who was a veteran. So to get a variety of perspectives, and I say this very honestly, having those different viewpoints on these works of art fundamentally changed how I saw many of them. So I'll tell you a couple of those stories as we walk through, but just to say that this is part of a much larger project at the PMA, the Portland Museum of Art, around really democratizing the way that we talk about art in those spaces, making it feel more accessible, but also enriching and enhancing the stories that we can tell by bringing in these new voices. So I want to give a ton of credit to this wonderful group who were able to do that for this exhibition. So the exhibition really starts with a prologue, and that was where we had the opportunity to show you some of the most iconic works from these two artists. And I'll start here with the Bronco Buster, which may be an object that's familiar to some of you. This is one of the earliest works in bronze by Frederic Remington. Remington comes late to making bronze in his career, but he comes at it with a lot of gusto. And this is the first bronze that he ever creates in 1895, but it becomes truly emblematic of a moment in the American West. We see this cowboy who is on this wild horse, but with tons of detail in the nature of his saddle and his tack. We see the musculature in the horse. It has everything to do with virility, with mastery of this animal and of the terrain. And it's something that struck a chord for the people who saw it at the time. They made many subsequent, Remington made subsequent casts and subsequent sizes, but as particularly for those of you in Washington, this struck a chord on a national level too. So we know that the Bronco Buster, we traced it back, we think, to Gerald Ford as the first president to have this in the Oval Office, but it is not an accident that the Bronco Buster has been in every Oval Office, be it a Democrat, be it a Republican, essentially from the Ford administration on. There is something indelible about this figure and about what he represents that universally across political party means something to the most powerful person in the United States. So Remington does something that matters and that lasts. Homer too is really foundational in understanding the American landscape, and that's both the landscape of Maine. So he spends his last 3 decades here on the Maine coast in Prout's Neck. You see an image here on the left of that, but really also of understanding man's relationship to the ocean. He becomes the kind of painter of all of those types of representations and was tremendously popular in his moment. So we begin the exhibition with this direct comparison between Homer's West Wind here on the left and Remington's Fall of the Cowboy here on the right. So this is a really prototypical and beautiful illustration of Homer at the height of his prowess. It's a very moody, evocative scene. We see the wind-swept figure, her tam-o'-shanter, she's having to hold on to it because of that wind, her clothes are flying, and Homer's using a really restricted palette of just browns and grays and whites to evoke not only that scene and the ocean, but also that very essence of the wind that's flying through. And he's using brushwork, like beautifully economical brushwork across the surface of that canvas to give us that sense of that wind. One of my favorite parts of this, I'll show you a detail right here, is that Homer's signature itself is actually aloft. You can see this here on the bottom left of this canvas. It itself is like flying off the page because of the force of that wind. So just a wonderful evocation of how detailed and terrific Homer can be at really evoking emotion, scene, and sensation. And compare that then to Remington's late work from 1895, The Fall of the Cowboy. Homer and Remington really as practitioners aren't often put together because of that wonderful gestural capacity that I alluded to here with Homer, and because of Remington's reputation really as a details guy. So he's someone who pays very close attention to objects, to materials, and I think largely because he's not someone from the American West. It's that accrual of detail that gives you the sense of authority on his part. But this is an image sort of later in Remington's career where I think he really is looking to practitioners like Homer. So instead of these really saturated colors that we'll see Remington use, this is a very muted landscape. Like Homer, he's using that muted palette of grays, of browns, of whites. And like Homer too, it's an elegiac kind of image that's evoking very much sensation too. We're feeling the loneliness of these two cowboys. We're feeling that kind of endlessness of the procession along this this kind of plain that's so cold. And it's an elegiac subject too, with a lot of nostalgia, because this is the Fall of the Cowboy really alludes to a moment when the open range has been closed down. So men who were skilled horsemen, who were bronco busters in their day, because the range has been closed down, has been privatized, they're not bringing huge herds across these expanses anymore, and essentially they're relegated to opening and closing fences. So it's the end of a way of life for these cowboys. So Remington's really doing a lot, and I think borrowing a good deal from Homer to be able to evoke that kind of mood and sensation. One of the really interesting things that we were able to do for this exhibition was to rely on the Amon Carter's conservation lab. And for those of you who don't know sort of how fantastic it is to have scientists on your team, this will prove it. We were able to do some X-ray of this image, and we were actually able to see some really interesting underpainting that no one had found before on the fall of the cowboy. And what we were able to see, and you can see this here in the image on the right, is when we did that X-ray, we actually found a painting underneath this painting. In that top portion that you see on the left as being really just that moody, evocative gray sky, we saw that Remington in the first iteration of this painting actually painted a train, and he actually had a different title for this painting as well. It was called the Home Drag, and what that refers to is the last moment before, when a cowboy brings all those cattle to a train depot. It's the last little bit before he gets them onto the train. So that train would have been bound for the east. It would have been bound for the slaughterhouses so that the folks in New York could have lovely steak dinners. But what this does, I think, is really kind of give you an insight into Remington at work. So this originally was a different subject, but it was a much more prescriptive, didactic, illustrative subject, right? This was a particular moment. This was as the cowboys were doing a very particular activity. And you'll see throughout the exhibition with Remington, his career is very much somebody who is trying to get out from under that moniker of illustrator. He's someone who becomes very popular as an illustrator working for magazines. And it's not until late in his career that he becomes the kind of painter of the universal subject. But you can see here that moment where he's really making that leap from something that feels much more specific to something that really is meant to evoke scene and mood in a much more universal, general way. I think much more indebted to artists like Homer. So the next kind of piece that you would walk through as you were coming through our exhibition deals with the early careers of both of these artists, which I just alluded to, but both of these artists come of age as artists, self-trained, but as illustrators. So famously for Homer, what that means is embedding in a regiment in Virginia and documenting the Civil War for American audiences, largely through Harper's Weekly. What that means for Remington a generation later is he's a kid who grows up hearing all sorts of exciting stories from his father, who was a Civil War veteran. So he's someone who is very excited to get into the field, and he ends up in the Spanish-American War as a reporter reporting on Cuba. So here you see a couple of instances where Homer is illustrating works from the Civil War, and then on the far right, an instance where we get a soldier that Remington is illustrating, I believe for Collier's or for Century from the Spanish-American War. And this is one of these moments, I have to say, where one of those outside voices was so pivotal in helping me understand an image. I looked at this central image called Trooper Meditating Beside a Grave with Doug Rollins, who was the head of Maine Veterans for Peace. And it's an image that I've looked at before. It's an image that I've understood on formal terms. But talking to Doug, thinking about what it means to have been a soldier on a battleground, to understand a battleground becoming a grave site. Doug talked about that black expanse, that kind of open piece of his shirt in the center, as a real kind of like void of meaning at the very heart of this person. He talked about the notion of moral injury, what it was like to be on a battlefield, and having that discussion with a veteran, I have to say, just gave a whole new meaning and a whole new gravity to Homer's image of a soldier who is reflecting on what it means to be in battle. So, so just one instance where really those outside voices were super important and interesting. So here's another opportunity that we had to discuss the ways in which both of these artists were spending time in certain places. So for Homer, again, that is embedded in a Union regiment, and then providing images for Harper's, which he then translates into his first oil painting. So you see that over here on the left. And Remington, who is making a variety of shorter trips out west to document skirmishes between indigenous communities and American forces, in addition to his work in Cuba. So you see here the old stagecoach of the plains, the painting, and then how the print culture then sort of retransformed Remington's work into a cover for a magazine. And you can see here Remington's dexterity too, and understanding how that printing is happening, and him very deliberately creating work that he knows is going to then sort of live that other life. So the next big kind of space of the exhibition is dedicated to these artists maturing from their early work as illustrators. For Homer, it was that leap from Harper's Illustrator through that sharpshooter oil painting into, with fair amount of ease, into the world of kind of fine art painter. For Remington, as I mentioned, it's a much harder leap, and it's one that takes him the majority of his career, in fact, to be sort of understood in serious terms as a painter of substance. But the term opposing forces really has everything to do with both of these men's choice of subject matter for the majority of their mature works. This also gave us an opportunity, parenthetically, to talk a little bit about their audiences, because it was an interesting surprise for me to learn that actually both of these men, although ostensibly they're painting very different types of subject matter, they're actually appealing to very similar clientele, and they're hobnobbing in the very same places throughout the course of their lives. We never were able to find instances where either of them documented having met each other. There's one photograph supposedly that pictures Homer and Remington at the same poker table, but for someone who's looked at a lot of pictures of Homer, it doesn't actually look that much like Homer to me, and it is not, we don't know for sure. But they're both at the Century Club. They're both in the very small art circles in New York, and they're both appealing to a moneyed set of elite male clients who at the turn of the century are just loving these images of high stakes male virility. So you see Undertow here on the left, an 1886 painting by Winslow Homer, A Dash for Timber over here on the right, which I hope you all get to see in person someday. It's at the Amon Carter. It's one of their gems of their collection. It's about 8 feet wide, and it really does feel for all the world like these guys are stampeding directly into your space. It feels full size. But these are super appealing to a group of patrons for whom the fears about stasis and decay, neurasthenia, so the kind of frenetic pace of urban life being overwhelming. They're looking to images of people like lifeguards, of cowboys. For Homer, it becomes Adirondack guides, really as these kind of proxies to be able to, if they can't be there themselves, be able to look at images of high stakes adventure, of untrammeled wilderness spaces. So though they seem a little bit different, these are both men who are very astutely finding a market amongst a group of patrons who are interested in looking out from urban spaces that feel like they're changing very quickly and to these kind of wild expanses and scenes of high drama. Undertow is a wonderful one to think about. It's one of Homer's kind of early forays into the ocean space right after he's moved to Prout's Neck. It's also this kind of study of Greco-Roman musculature in some ways, this image of the lifeguard here on the left. Keep that gesture in mind, but that notion, my colleague Maggie Eibler at the Amon Carter likes to talk about this at the same moment that bodybuilding is becoming a real big thing. It's also the moment when college athletics are coming to the fore, this turn of the century notion of kind of physical well-being as directly connected, you can see through this gesture, to moral and mental fortitude, very much in display in an image like this. And you see this too, I love this about Homer. It translates across his images of men as well as of women. You see here the Fisher Girl, a wonderful image from the Mead Art Museum in Amherst. And she is actually enacting a very similar gesture. She is as statuesque as her male counterparts in Undertow. And I love too that notion of thinking about a kind of Greco-Roman body. She's got those fishnets that are arrayed, at least in, it looks to me kind of almost in a kind of robe-like way. So the women in Homer's images, as well as the men who are related to the ocean, have that statuesqueness about them and that strength. So I'll turn back to Dash for Timber for a little bit, just because it is such a kind of tour de force for Remington. It gives you a sense, as I mentioned, that Remington is kind of a wonderful purveyor of specificity. So I think he kind of made up for not actually having been living in these spaces by a profusion of detail about the materials of these spaces. He's someone who likes to dress up like a cowboy. He's got a studio that is chock full of objects that have to do with cowboys. He had a full-size saddle. He had a whole bunch of indigenous materials. And in this turn that is sort of very perfectly Remington, you can actually visit a recreation of his studio in Cody, Wyoming at the Buffalo Bill Center for the American West, which was airlifted wholesale from Ogdensburg, New York, or from New Rochelle, rather, from New Rochelle, where a suburb of New York City where Remington had his studio. So that transplantation of an Eastern studio chock full of Western objects into the center of cowboy culture, kind of extremely fitting for someone like Remington. But you see him really taking such pleasure and such interest in all of these little specifics of the way a hat curls, or particulars of the tack of these horses. Also just that sense of propulsive motion that he's so good at. He was an astute observer of horses. He was an equestrian in his youth. He actually you could maybe tell from the first picture, he gets a little too portly to be able to get on a horse later in life. But someone who spends time at the racetrack and understanding the kind of physical locomotion of these animals. If you're thinking that there's resonance with Edward Muybridge and his early studies of equine motion, you're absolutely right. He's thinking about Muybridge and that early photography and how you arrest motion. For him, it's in the context of paint and bronze, as we'll see. For Muybridge, it was photography. He's also this kind of lovely visualizer of a sense of camaraderie and group sort of collegiality amongst these types of cowboys. So you see this translate that notion of motion, but also that notion of kind of group togetherness. You see that both in an image like A Dash for Timber, but then also in subsequent bronze work like The Wounded Bunkie from 1896 that really has everything to do with kind of buddies helping buddies. So the next section we called Up North. And again, this was this lovely surprise for us. We in the Portland Museum have a beautiful collection of watercolors from Homer's time in the Adirondacks. These are extremely well-known images that Homer paints from a lifelong preoccupation with that particular space, a space of great wildness, beauty, very rugged guides who are the kind of experts in hunting and fishing. This was a very popular space for, again, that kind of elite business person from New York or from Boston to spend some time up in the wilderness in rather rugged surroundings with a guide to be able to kind of commune and connect with that natural vision. What we didn't know was, in fact, that this was also a place that was important to Remington. So I mentioned that Remington was born in Ogdensburg, New York. He spends essentially his adult life in New Rochelle, but he also has this beautiful cabin on the St. Lawrence River and called Inglenook. And there's a beautiful series of these fresh, really impressionistic watercolors. And these are actually oils that we were able to show. But Remington spends a great deal of time in this kind of northeastern part of the United States, and he paints it with a lot of excitement and beauty, and does a lot of experimentation with techniques borrowed from American Impressionism while he's up there. So that northern space, that northeastern space, is a shared space for both Homer and Remington, and they both portray it with a lot of personal experience and fidelity to it. Another instance where we were able to pair, this is a watercolor from the PMA's collection with one of the major works from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I call the Other PMA. And this is an opportunity to see how Homer's working in two different types of media, but to visualize the figure of the guide in two different seasons in that space of the Adirondacks. So the last portion of the exhibition, we called it the finale, but it's an opportunity to take a moment with the late works of both of these artists. So for Homer, what that means is a sustained period in the space of Prouts Neck. So in a fairly a little populated space and time for him to really spend thinking about the relationship of humans to the natural environment. Increasingly, we see the human figure fall away from the images that Homer's creating in this late moment. Oftentimes, what we get are these real kind of confrontations between land and sea. And he's really sort of, again, becoming the master of that very sensory evocation of a particular space in a landscape. For Remington, this last end of his career, and Remington dies young, so these two men, a generation apart, both died within a year of each other because Remington dies quite young. But this last kind of bit of Remington's career is a moment where he does gain the critical acclaim that has been so elusive, with this moniker of illustrator kind of dogging him. He really begins to create a series that he calls Nocturnes. And this is a moment when critics begin to understand that Remington is providing something unique, special, and pretty profound to the oeuvre of American art. So I'm showing you here a work called Midnight Wolf, where you see that Remington's applying this very kind of strange, almost acrid palette of greens, of grays, of blacks, but to create that ambiguity that Homer was such a master at. These aren't the kind of action-driven Westerns that we think of as so endemic to the middle part of Remington's career. These are quiet images. They're oftentimes sort of enigmatic images. They're images often that have to do with tension, so they're not relaxed. They are really sort of like pent up, but it's the moment before action. So with Moonlight Wolf, we see the glint in this wolf's eye. He has clearly noticed us as the intruder into his space, but the ambiguity of water and his reflection versus land, the strangeness of when mountains sort of merges into sky, those reflective stars that really sort of give us a very warped sense of kind of what is physical and what is ethereal. Remington is able to play with in beautiful ways. And thinking too about Remington and an interest in photography, this is also, it's an interesting moment where Remington is using a palette that's suggestive actually of flash photography of that moment. So the turn of the century is this time when cities are thinking about how you electrify large spaces, and photographers are thinking about how you create a flash in a dark space. So that kind of like hyper strange light of an illuminated, very dark space actually has some resonance in early flash photography. So you'll see that here in these beautiful images over here on the left, where Remington is exploring that kind of strange palette too, and that notion of just encounter in a dark time, that kind of very real sensation of fear and strangeness of finding someone in a dark space and not knowing exactly who that person may or may not be, whether that person may or may not be friendly. That's particularly in this image on the lower left called Shotgun Hospitality, an encounter between a Western cowboy and three indigenous figures. One of our writers, Jennifer Peektu, wrote in really beautiful terms about what that type of encounter, that kind of fraught type of encounter, and the prevalence of the blanket in these images too, and what that would have meant, particularly at this moment when indigenous communities are being pushed off land, are being thrown in many cases into schools where they're being asked to kind of shed one identity for another. That blanket becomes like a particularly potent symbol. So Jennifer wrote about that in beautiful ways that really helped us understand these images in new ways. And juxtaposing that too then with this beautiful image by Winslow Homer from the Clark Institute, who too is thinking about that kind of end of the day, that particularity of a certain light. This is one that he talks about very specifically as happening 15 minutes after sunset, specifically at a very particular point, West Point on Prout's Neck. So for Homer too, someone who's just a master of understanding a particular atmosphere, a particular time of day, and evoking that for his audiences with a lot of beautiful sensation. So I have one last slide, which is a sort of shameless plug for the catalog for this exhibition, which is still available. And I encourage you all to pick it up because myself and my colleagues really do kind of tease out a lot of these threads in a little more depth. But I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'm grateful for your attention. So thank you so much. I'll stop sharing too, so we can all see each other.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwold. That was really amazing. What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Really fabulous. So if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, or if you prefer to put your question in the chat box, either one is fine. I will, you can electronically raise your hand, or you can just physically raise your hand, and I am happy to recognize you and have you ask your question if you don't want to put in the chat box. I do want to say that you've gotten a few kudos in the chat box already, so people are definitely appreciative and understand what a well-researched and thoughtful presentation this has been. It's really been fabulous. We have an expert, people. Are there any questions you have for her? Anything you'd like to know or didn't know, or something you learned today that you'd like to discuss?
I'd be curious, and it was indeed wonderful, but I'm curious what inspired you to juxtapose these two particular artists?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is so partially this is kind of the way museums work. There was a great interest in having a collaboration between these three institutions. So this was actually not a project lodged from, like a real need on my part to get to the heart of this. I will say that having been sort of thrown this suggestion, can we think about these two artists together? It became subsequently then this really interesting kind of conversation over the course of several years between the three institutions of how that happened. There's also been, because these are essentially the two most famous artists of the 19th century, there have been sort of in fits and starts, different efforts to think about them collectively. This was the first time that that a museum ever, or a group of museums ever really kind of tried the project. But it did, having that framework of myth making and of these two artists as creating those enduring images really did subsequently, like it came a little bit backwards, but it did end up kind of providing this sort of wonderful framework to think about a lot of those really big, meaty, difficult entanglements that represent that Gilded Age moment.
Thank you, Fred. I see that you've unmuted and your hand is up. Yes.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I can't thank you enough. I was curious, you mentioned that both were basically self-trained, and I wondered if you could expand on that a little. And obviously the juxtaposition was meant for us to understand better how they influenced each other, but who were their major influences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are both largely self-trained. By that, I mean, like, neither of them are spending time working with, like, formally with other artists or attending schools. It's a little disingenuous on both of their parts to suggest that they are entirely self-trained. So Homer, for instance, spends a year in the 1860s in Paris. He's clearly spending a lot of time looking at the Parisian artists of the day. So those are obviously influences on his work. We know too that, I mean, just from the milieu that these two men are living and working in New York, like, they are aware of artists that are coming in and through. Turner is a big influence for them. So the British artists they're thinking and looking at. But that notion of kind of self-taughtness is very much, again, this kind of other American mythology. it's something that they both like to, as they're both wonderful self-promoters, I should say too. And so it's part of the way that they kind of bolster themselves, is by saying like, we were not part of academies. We didn't spend time, like painstakingly in the French mode of the academy. Like we are like learned in these kind of rugged spaces of being really sort of like on the ground, so to speak. So that is primarily the way that they learned. But again, like slightly disingenuous because they are both cosmopolitans who are enmeshed in much wider international networks.
Thank you.
And another question we have is in the chat box, how unique is it that both artists started as illustrators?
That's a good question. I think it's certainly not crazy. I mean, this was on the heels, actually, this exhibition of a show that I didn't put together, but that a colleague of mine put together about N.C. Wyeth, who that anxiety about being an illustrator, that pressure and stress about being just an illustrator rather than an artist, that notion of someone really wanting to break out and up into the realm of kind of full-scale artist rather than illustrator, it was very present in the narrative around N.C. Wyeth. So it's not something that is unique to these two artists. But I think in the realm, as we suggested, or as we were talking about a little bit, of artists who aren't coming up through academies, who are more self-taught, it's more prevalent for those folks rather than the folks who are working kind of in the more established systems and channels.
Thank you. Emily, I think you had a question.
Well, first I wanted to thank you so much for a marvelous presentation and for thought-provoking ideas that at least I had never even thought of the two men as anything similar. But I know when I've thought of Frederic Remington, I've always thought about his sculptures and not about his artwork. And I wondered if his sculptures in any way, if he has any contemporaries from his time who also did sculptures that you would compare to his, or is that something unique to him? And how did that affect his artwork? I mean, he's obviously multi-talented.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will say right off the bat that I am by no means a Western American expert, so I don't know too much about other folks who are doing equestrians bronzes at the same time. I do know that Remington he's pretty unique in the way he does it. Again, he's pretty much self-taught in the realm of bronze sculpture. So in some ways, that's actually a real boon, because a lot of the ways that kind of traditional sculpture has the sort of rules of sculpture, he doesn't worry about. So that notion of sort of lateral propulsion that you get in so many of Remington sculptures, where those horses are charging forward, where everyone seems sort of breakneck in one direction, it's very different from that linearity that you see in so much 19th century sculpture before Remington. So he really is breaking a lot of ground, and these are immediately extremely successful. So as I mentioned with Bronco Bust, like you've seen so many of them because they are all over the place, because Remington understood that they were saleable on a small level if you didn't have the funds to pay for the big one. He's working with a foundry who's able to create multiples of these. So they're in museums all over the place. They're, as we mentioned, in the Oval Office. So it's a way that Remington does become very popular, but it's also the way in which he translates that wonderful specificity and energy of his canvases into another medium. So much of what he's able to observe and to understand about the dynamics of kind of animals in motion and people in relationship to those animals, like I think gets sort of beautifully translated between media. And they're very popular at the time, and he really is sort of the sculptor of those Western subjects of his moment.
So, okay.
Sorry, I muted myself. So Lorna writes that it's fascinating that so many presidents have included the Bronco in the art showcase in the Oval Office. have any of them commented on the work, why they like it? Is it the best representation of the West, the independent American?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is, I mean, so I hesitate to say this is one of Donald Trump's slip ups when he was president. Was they had, some of you may have caught this in the news. So as he was bringing some reporter through the Oval Office, and the reporter innocently looked at Bronco Buster and said, "Oh, that must be Teddy Roosevelt." And Donald Trump was like, "Absolutely, it totally is." So it's not, for the record, it's a cowboy with a mustache. I joke that like the specter of Teddy Roosevelt is in fact like hovering over this entire exhibition. You know, that rugged independence, that bravura masculinity, the imperial incursions across the globe, like it's all Roosevelt there. But Donald Trump is not, he's not correct in suggesting that the subject of that is Teddy Roosevelt. He was pointing it out because it was of particular interest. But it is, I mean, it's such an interesting thing, right? To note or to understand, to try to get your head around why that object in particular is this like universal signifier. I mean, I think for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about, right? It is like, it's this solitary figure, it's this independent figure, it's this figure that's tamed the landscape in this way that feels very legible in this. And it's a, you know, he's a master in bronze work too. So it's also like object wise, it's a fascinating and detailed object. So I think those are some of the reasons, but it absolutely has, it has come up. And, you know, like these are also like all of those photographs I showed you, they're staged to the hilt, right? So these, it's not only that it happens to be in the Oval Office, it's that these presidents want to be seen right next to it. So there is something enduring and important.
Absolutely. Lorna, did you have another question?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. They're great questions.
A few years back, the Portrait Gallery did an exhibit called Hide and Seek about homosexuals. And I recall one of the curators saying at the time that there was this response to have kind of manly art was because women had taken over society in the latter part of the 19th century. So this was the men pushing back. Do you have that sensibility from this exhibit?
Gosh, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think like a lot of these late 19th century things are read as sort of anxiety and responses to anxiety. So I'm sure there is something to that there is, women are emerging from a purely domestic sphere. They are increasingly taking on more important roles in more public spaces. And I'm sure that some of this hyper masculine type of imagery does have to do with that. I mean, just in terms of kind of coded sexuality, it's a really interesting project to kind of, I kept joking that I could do a kind of like, there's a lot of latent sexuality in a lot of these images. That homosocial world of cowboys is a very interesting one to unpack in those terms. So, you know, those Greco-Roman torsos, like there's a juicy kind of alternative tour that I always wanted to give, but never had quite the audience to do it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to unpack there for sure. And Homer, I mean, there's speculation about Homer too. He was a lifelong bachelor. So who knows?
Well, I will offer you that if you want to give that juicy tour at a CCC program, I think you'd have plenty of interest. Okay, mom's prerogative. Let's go to your mother. Betty,
You mean? Okay, it's a twofold question. One, did either these artists ever meet each other? And also, were they both financially successful with their art?
Yeah, good questions. So ultimately, Remington is very commercially successful as an illustrator. You can make a good living that way. With his painting, less so, again, until the sort of last bit of his career. Homer also like a comfortable living, and he's extremely well known, but he, for much of his life, is kind of relying on the largesse of his older brother, Charles. The question of whether they met or not is an interesting one. We were like super preoccupied with it at the beginning of the project. I mentioned this photograph that is in the Samuel's biography, the kind of earliest official biography of Remington, has this image where they say it is Winslow Homer and Frederic Remington at a poker table together. It doesn't look a ton like Homer to me. And we couldn't track down any sort of authoritative source that would actually verify that. So it kind of quickly became for us kind of less interesting whether they actually met and more interesting to understand their kind of larger impacts together. But I mean, gosh, one of the essays in this book actually is by my colleague, Jennifer Henneman, and she does the work of kind of retracing both of their footsteps in New York City. And they are, like, they're within blocks of each other, and they're showing at the same exhibitions, and their patronage is there's a lot of overlap. So, I mean, they absolutely knew of one another. Whether they met, we have no idea. We kind of, we had a lot of other names for the show, one of which was the curmudgeon and the jerk. Remington's kind of famously like a jerk. And Homer is quite reclusive. So we had this sort of image of Remington kind of extremely eager to meet Homer, and Homer with absolutely no interest in meeting Remington. Whether that is true, I have no idea. It's pure speculation, but yes, we don't. So the short answer is we don't know whether they ever met in person. We don't have any evidence of it, but impossible that they didn't know of one another quite well.
Looks like your father has a question. There you go.
You showed a number of pictures with very dark palettes, kind of twilight views. Were they familiar with Whistler's Nocturnes? Is that an important influence?
Yes, absolutely. And again, this notion too, that they're at this moment where technologies are enabling a kind of visioning of nightscapes, both urban and rural, I think is important both for Whistler, but also for Homer and Remington. But yes, the Nocturnes had a big impact on American artists, even though Whistler is mostly showing in Europe. They were both absolutely looking at those. And I mean, Remington refers to those night scenes as nocturnes. So that is an absolute and direct reference to the popularity of Whistler's scenes.
Well, okay, I think we've now gone through all the questions, and really you have done an outstanding job. Thank you so very much for this presentation. Emily, thank you for arranging it. It really was quite a treat for us. And as I mentioned, we would be happy to have you back. So let us know when you're free, and we'll be happy to schedule something on one of your other topic areas. I also want to remind people that next week we have Helen Adelson speaking on November 3rd, talking about retirement and how to make the best of retirement, how to live your best life in retirement. So please join us for that presentation. If you don't have the email link and you'd like it, you all got here, you know how to contact me, and we're happy to send out the link to you. So please, thank you for joining us tonight, and enjoy your evening. And thank you very much again.
My pleasure. Nice to see everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.